The drive to the cabin had been uneventful, if not a little too quiet. 7 of us piled into 2 cars, backpacks stuffed with snacks, clothes, and whatever gear we thought we'd need for a weekend off-grid. The place was deep in the woods, miles from the nearest gas station. That was part of its appeal: no cell service, no distractions, just us and the forest. When we arrived, the cabin looked exactly like the photos online: rustic, with a slanted roof and a wraparound porch, framed by towering pines. A small creek trickled nearby, and the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. Inside, the place was cozy but a little rundown: uneven floorboards, faded wallpaper, and a faint musty smell that hinted at years of disuse. Still, we were excited. It was perfect for a weekend escape. It started when we were unpacking. Lucy, ever the curious one, found the door. "Hey, did you guys see this?" she called from the far end of the hallway. We all wandered over, expecting something mundane, but there it was, a door none of us had noticed when we walked in. It was painted the same color as the wall, blending in so well it might have been invisible if you weren't looking closely. Lucy ran her fingers over the handle, a tarnished brass knob that seemed oddly out of place compared to the rest of the cabin's simple decor. "This wasn't in the photos, was it?" Jake asked, leaning in. His tone was casual, but I saw the way his eyebrows pinched together. "Who cares?" Lucy said with a grin. "Mystery door in the middle of nowhere. I'm opening it." "Maybe it's a closet," Mia suggested, though she sounded uncertain. "Or storage." But when Lucy twisted the knob and pushed, it didn't open to shelves or junk. It opened to darkness. A narrow, windowless room stretched beyond, the walls painted a deep gray that seemed to drink in the light. The air coming from inside was cold, far colder than the rest of the cabin, and carried a faint metallic smell that made me think of blood. "Whoa," Lucy said, taking a cautious step forward. "It's empty." I peeked over her shoulder. She was right. The room was bare, just 4 walls and a floor, no furniture, no decorations. The walls were oddly smooth, as if they'd been sanded down to an unnatural perfection. Something about it didn't feel right, and I felt a prickle of unease crawl up my spine. "You sure we should go in there?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. "It's weird." "Don't be such a wimp," Lucy teased, stepping fully into the room. Her laughter echoed oddly, the sound too sharp, like it was bouncing off walls that shouldn't have been that close together. She spun around, grinning. "See? It's just a room." Jake followed her, then Mia, and the others hesitated only for a moment before joining in. I stayed at the threshold, my stomach churning with an inexplicable sense of dread. I couldn't put my finger on why, but something about the room felt wrong. Like it wasn't supposed to be there. "Come on," Lucy said, waving me in. "It's not like it's going to eat you." Reluctantly, I stepped inside. The cold hit me first, biting through my sweater and making my skin prickle. The smell was stronger now, a mix of rust and earth, like the cabin had bled into the room itself. I glanced around, looking for anything to explain what this room was. That's when the door slammed shut. The sound was deafening, a metallic clang that rattled my teeth. Everyone froze, spinning toward the door. Jake lunged for the knob, twisting it hard, but it didn't budge. "Very funny," he muttered, shooting a glare at Lucy, but she was across the room, nowhere near the door. "It wasn't me," she said, her voice tight. "It must have slammed itself." Jake yanked at the door again, harder this time, his knuckles whitening. It didn't move. He kicked it in frustration, the thud echoing like a gunshot. "It's stuck," he said, breathless. "It's seriously stuck." "Let me try," Mia said, pushing past him. She tried the knob, then shoved her shoulder against the wood, but the door didn't give an inch. She stepped back, her face pale. "What the hell?" "It's an old cabin," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Maybe the wood swelled or something. It'll open." Except it didn't. Minutes turned into an hour. Jake, Mia, and Lucas took turns throwing their weight against the door, trying everything from brute force to prying at the edges with a pocket knife. The rest of us stood in the middle of the room, the cold sinking into our bones, watching in growing unease as the door refused to move. Okay, this is ridiculous, Lucy said, her bravado slipping. Doors don't just lock themselves like this. Maybe someone locked us in, Mia said, her voice shaking, like some kind of prank or something. Who? Lucas snapped. We're the only ones here. No one had an answer. The air in the room seemed heavier now, pressing against my chest. I felt like I couldn't get a full breath. I rubbed my arms, trying to shake the cold, but it wasn't just the temperature. It was the room itself, like it was closing in around us, the walls somehow closer than they'd been before. And then Lucy screamed. We all whipped around to see her standing near the far wall, her hands clutched to her mouth. Her eyes were wide, darting around the room. Did you hear that? She whispered. Hear what? Jake asked, his voice clipped with frustration. It was like whispering. Right in my ear. She glanced over her shoulder, her face pale. I thought it was one of you, but... No one was near you, Mia said, her voice small. We're all over here. Lucy opened her mouth to argue but stopped. Her gaze darted to the floor. What is that? We followed her stare. At first I didn't see it. The floor was plain wood, scuffed and uneven, but as I stared, a faint shape emerged, a handprint, smeared in something dark, just beneath Lucy's feet. It hadn't been there before. What the hell? Lucas muttered, stepping back. He bent down, brushing his fingers over the mark, then jerked his hand away. It's wet. The whispers started then, faint, almost imperceptible, like a breeze brushing through leaves, but there was no wind here. The sound grew louder, overlapping voices that came from nowhere and everywhere all at once. Stop it, Mia said, clutching her ears. Make it stop. No one was making it happen. Hey, Jake shouted, his voice cracking. He kicked the door again, harder this time, then started pounding on it with his fists. Hey, let us out. But no one was coming. Jake's fists hit the door over and over. The sounded desperate rhythm against the oppressive quiet that had fallen in the room. The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, skittering across the edges of my hearing, just low enough that I couldn't make out the words, but high enough to make my stomach twist. Jake, Mia said softly, her voice trembling. Stop. It's not working. Then what do you suggest? Jake snapped, spinning on her. His face was red, a vein bulging at his temple. We just sit here and wait for whatever the hell this is too. Listen, Lucy whispered, cutting him off. She was crouched near the floor, her head cocked to the side. Do you hear that? Hear what? Lucas asked, his tone sharp with fear. It's underneath us, Lucy said, her voice barely audible. Something's moving. Everyone went silent. For a moment, all I could hear was the sound of my own ragged breathing, but then I felt its soft vibrations beneath my feet, a faint thrum that made the floorboards quiver. It wasn't random, it was rhythmic, like a slow heartbeat. Maybe it's the pipes, I said, though I didn't believe it even as the words left my mouth. There were no radiators in this cabin, no plumbing that could make a noise like that. It's not the pipes, Lucy whispered. Her face was pale, her wide eyes locked on the floor. It's crawling. What's crawling? Mia asked, her voice breaking. Lucy didn't answer. Instead, she stood and backed away from the spot, her hands trembling. I don't know. But it's moving. The heartbeat-like thrum grew louder, pulsing through the room. I pressed my palms to my ears, trying to block it out, but it was inside me now, vibrating in my chest and skull. The others were panicking, Jake shouting curses at the door, while Mia clutched Lucas's arm, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. Lucy stood frozen near the far wall, her mouth moving as if she were talking to herself. Lucy, I said, taking a step toward her. She didn't respond. Her lips kept moving, forming words I couldn't hear. I reached out to touch her shoulder, but she flinched violently, spinning to face me. Her eyes were wild, her pupils blown wide. They're in the walls, she said hoarsely. They're watching us. What? I asked, stepping back. They're in the walls, she screamed, louder this time. Her voice cracked, the sound raw and jagged. They're watching. I can hear them. Before she could finish, the lights flickered, a sudden strobe of brightness that made the shadows stretch and twist unnaturally across the walls. Then the bulb overhead buzzed and popped, plunging us into darkness. Mia screamed, a high, thin sound that made my blood run cold. I heard Jake cursing, his footsteps heavy as he stumbled toward the door, and Lucas shouting for someone to stay calm. But no one was calm. The whispers were louder now, swirling around us, voices layered on voices, a chaotic symphony that made it impossible to think. Something brushed against my arm, cold, slick, and impossibly fast. I jerked back, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who was that?" I yelled, my voice cracking. No one answered. A new sound joined the whispers then, a soft scratching, like fingernails scraping against wood. It came from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, everywhere at once. I backed up, my hands outstretched, trying to feel for anything solid in the suffocating blackness. "Guys," Jake's voice came, shaky and distant. "Guys, where are you?" "I'm here," I shouted, but my voice sounded muffled, swallowed by the room. I could barely hear him. The scratching grew louder, faster, until it sounded like claws raking against the wood. Then it stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so thick I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I held my breath, my body trembling, waiting for the next sound. That's when I felt it. Something was behind me. It wasn't a touch, exactly more like a presence, a weight pressing against my back. My skin prickled, and every instinct screamed at me to move, but I couldn't. My legs were locked, frozen in place. Slowly I turned my head, my breath hitching in my throat. In the dim light filtering from the cracks around the door, I saw it. A face, if you could call it that, hovering inches from mine. It was featureless, pale and smooth like melted wax, with no eyes or mouth, but I could feel it staring at me. The air around it was cold, suffocating, and carried that same metallic tang I'd smelled when we first entered the room. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on something. I hit the floor hard, pain shooting up my arm, but I didn't care. I scrambled away, gasping for air, as the thing seemed to fade back into the darkness. "Help me," Mia's voice came from somewhere to my left, raw and panicked. "Please, somebody help me." I crawled toward the sound, my hands scraping against the rough floorboards. The whispers were deafening now, swirling around me like a storm. I thought I heard my name in them, fragmented and distorted, but I didn't stop to listen. When I reached Mia, she was on her knees, clutching at something on the floor. Her fingers were covered in dark streaks, and I realized with a jolt that it was blood. A pool of it spread beneath her, seeping up from the cracks in the wood. "It won't stop," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "It keeps coming. Make it stop." I grabbed her shoulders, shaking her. "Mia, look at me. What's coming?" "What?" Before I could finish, the floor beneath us groaned, a low, mournful sound that made my stomach drop. The boards began to splinter, jagged cracks spreading out from the bloodstained spot. I pulled Mia to her feet, dragging her away, just as the floor gave way. A gaping hole yawned open, revealing nothing but darkness beneath. It wasn't just dark, it was absolute, a void that seemed to swallow the light. And from that void came a sound, low and guttural, like the growl of some ancient, starving thing. We backed away, clutching each other, as the growl grew louder, reverberating through the room. The whispers rose to a fever pitch, overlapping with the growl in a maddening cacophony. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. All I knew was that we had to get out. "Jake," I screamed, my voice hoarse. "Lucas, where are you?" But no one answered. The growl seemed to shake the entire room, deep and resonant, more felt than heard. It seemed alive, like the cabin itself was breathing, groaning under the strain of whatever had been disturbed. The hole in the floor yawned wider, jagged edges crumbling into the void. Something moved within it, a shifting shadow that defied logic, twisting and curling like smoke in water. "Mia, we need to move," I shouted, yanking her arm. She stumbled after me, her face a mask of terror. We backed into the nearest wall, pressing ourselves flat against it, as if that could protect us. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst, the adrenaline making my vision blur at the edges. The whispers hadn't stopped. If anything, they were growing louder, their cadence erratic, almost almost mocking. Then Jake's voice cut through the chaos. "Get over here," he shouted, his silhouette barely visible against the faint light seeping through the cracks around the door. He was waving his arms, frantically gesturing for us to come to him. "We're getting out of here." I didn't know how he thought we'd manage that, but I didn't care. I pulled Mia with me, half dragging her across the uneven floor as we stumbled toward Jake. The room felt different now, warped somehow. The walls seemed to stretch and tilt, as if the space itself was shifting around us. Lucas appeared next to Jake, his face pale and drenched in sweat. He was holding something, a long, rusted piece of metal that might have been part of an old pipe. He was using it to pry at the edges of the door, the wood groaning under the strain. "Hurry," Jake yelled as we reached them. "It's starting to give." I glanced over my shoulder. The hole in the floor was spreading, a web of cracks radiating out from its edges. The dark shape inside was rising now, slowly unfurling like some grotesque flower. It had no defined form, no edges or limbs, just a mass of shifting blackness that pulsed with an unnatural rhythm. "Lucas, keep going," I urged, shoving Mia toward the door. She collapsed against it, her hands clawing at the wood, as if sheer desperation could force it open. I grabbed the pipe from Lucas and jammed it into the crack he'd made, putting all my weight into it. The door creaked, splinters flying as the wood began to give. Then Lucy screamed again, and my blood ran cold. She was standing near the far wall, her back to us. Her arms were limp at her sides, her head tilted slightly as if she were listening to something. "Lucy," I shouted, but she didn't move. Her shoulders were trembling, and when she finally turned, her face was pale, her lips moving silently. "What are you doing?" Jake demanded. "Get over here." "There." Calling me Lucy said, her voice distant, like she was speaking through a dream. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused, and her body swayed slightly as she took a step toward the hole. "No," Mia screamed, lunging for her, but I grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "Don't," I said, my voice shaking. "It's too late." Lucy stepped closer to the hole, the blackness within reaching up like tendrils, curling around her ankles. She didn't resist. She didn't even seem to notice. Her expression was blank, serene, as if she were walking into a warm embrace. "Lucy," Jake bellowed, dropping the pipe and running toward her. I tried to grab him, to stop him, but he was too fast. He reached her just as the tendrils tightened, yanking her downward with an impossible force. Jake grabbed her arm, pulling with all his strength, but the thing in the hole was stronger. Lucy didn't even scream. She disappeared into the void, and Jake was nearly pulled in after her, his body jerking violently as he fought against the pull. "Help him," Mia shrieked, and Lucas and I sprang into action, grabbing Jake's arms and pulling him back with everything we had. The tendrils reached for him, curling around his legs and torso, cold and slick against my skin as I fought to pull him free. With a final, desperate heave, we yanked him away. He collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath, but the tendrils didn't follow. They retreated into the hole, which began to shrink, the edges curling inward like burning paper. We all stared, frozen, as the void sealed itself, leaving nothing behind but splintered wood and the faint scent of blood. "She's gone," Jake whispered, his voice hollow. He stared at the spot where Lucy had stood, his hands trembling. "She's gone." None of us had an answer. The door creaked then, a soft groan that made all of us jump. Slowly it swung open on its own, revealing the dimly lit hallway beyond. The air that rushed in was warm, almost stifling, a stark contrast to the freezing cold we'd endured inside the room. "Let's go," Lucas said, his voice tight. "Now." We didn't need to be told twice. Jake was still shaking, barely able to stand, but we pulled him to his feet and half carried him out of the room. Mia was sobbing, her breath hitching with every step, but none of us looked back. As soon as we crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang. The sound echoed through the cabin, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I turned to look at the door, my heart pounding. It was gone. The wall was smooth, seamless, as if the door had never existed. We stood in the hallway, staring at the now seamless wall. No one spoke. The door was gone, erased like it had never been there. Only the faint metallic smell clung to the air, a sick reminder that what had just happened wasn't some shared hallucination. Jake finally broke the silence, his voice hollow. "Lucy's gone." Mia let out a choked sob, covering her face with her hands. Lucas grabbed her shoulders, trying to steady her, but his own hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold on. None of us knew what to say, what to do. The weight of what we'd just seen pressed down on all of us like a suffocating fog. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We need to leave. Now." Jake turned to me, his face pale and drawn. "We can't just leave her." "She's gone," Lucas snapped, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. "You saw what happened, Jake. She's not coming back." "We don't know that," Jake shouted, his voice cracking. "That thing, it took her. She could still be alive." Lucas cut him off, his eyes flashing. "Is that what you're about to say? Because if you think she's alive in whatever that was, you're lying to yourself." Jake's jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might throw a punch, but he just turned away, pacing a few steps before slamming his fist against the nearest wall. The sound echoed through the cabin, hollow and empty, like everything else about this place. "We have to leave," I repeated, louder this time. "This cabin, this place, it's wrong. It's not safe." "I'm not leaving her," Jake said through clenched teeth. "She's gone," Mia screamed, her voice ragged. She collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. "We're all going to die here." "Stop it," Lucas said, kneeling beside her. His tone softened, but his own fear was evident. "We're not going to die. We just need to get out of the woods. We'll call for help." "How?" Jake asked, his voice dripping with bitterness. "There's no service out here, remember? Even if we make it back to the cars, we're miles from anything." "We'll walk if we have to," I said. "I don't care. I'm not staying in this cabin another second." The others didn't argue. Slowly we gathered what little strength we had and stumbled toward the front door. The cabin felt different now. The air was thick, heavy with an unshakable sense of dread, and the shadows seemed to move just out of the corners of my vision. I kept my eyes forward, refusing to look too closely at anything for fear of what I might see. When we reached the front door, Lucas grabbed the handle and twisted. It didn't move. "No," he whispered, trying again. He put his shoulder into it, slamming his body against the wood, but it didn't budge. "No, no, no, come on." "Don't," Mia said, her voice trembling. "Don't tell me it's locked." "It's stuck," Lucas said, his voice rising in panic. "It's like the door in the hallway. It won't open." "Break it down," Jake said, stepping forward. His voice was calmer now, but his eyes burned with a dangerous intensity. "We'll break it down." Lucas nodded, backing up a few steps before throwing himself at the door. The wood groaned but held firm. He tried again, this time with Jake slamming into it beside him. Each hit sent vibrations through the floor, but the door didn't give an inch. "It's not working," Lucas yelled, slamming his fist against the doorframe. "Why isn't it working?" "It won't let us leave," Mia said, her voice barely audible. She was staring at the floor, her eyes wide and unblinking. "It won't let us go." "What are you talking about?" Jake demanded, but even as he said it, I could see the fear in his eyes. "This place," she whispered. "It's alive. It took Lucy, and now it's taking us." "No," I said, shaking my head. "No, we're not trapped. There's got to be another way out." "Like what?" Lucas asked bitterly. "The windows are too small to crawl through, and the only other door." As he stopped, his face going pale. "The room," I said, my stomach dropping. We all turned to look down the hallway. The seamless wall was still there, the door to the room erased like it had never existed, but I could feel it. The cold, the wrongness, was still there, radiating from that spot like a pulse. "We're not going back in there," Mia said, her voice rising hysterically. "I don't care what happens. I'm not going back." "We don't have a choice," Jake said quietly. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "It's the only way." "You don't know that," Lucas said. "What if it's just another trap? What if we go in there and it takes all of us? What's the alternative? Jake shot back. Stay here and wait for whatever this is to finish us off. Stop, I said, stepping between them. Arguing isn't helping. We need to think. But the truth was, I couldn't think. My mind was racing, my thoughts a chaotic mess of fear and despair. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't see a way out. The cabin had us, and it wasn't letting go. And then the whispers started again. They were faint at first, barely audible, but they grew louder with each passing second. They weren't coming from the hallway this time, they were everywhere. In the walls, the floor, the ceiling, surrounding us. Mia screamed, clapping her hands over her ears. Lucas staggered back, his eyes darting around the room. Jake grabbed the nearest object, a chair, and hurled it at the wall. It shattered into pieces, but the whispers didn't stop. "We have to do something," Jake shouted. "We can't just stand here." I didn't answer. My eyes were locked on the hallway, on the spot where the door had been. The air around it seemed to ripple, like heat rising from pavement. I took a step toward it, my body moving before my mind could catch up. "Where are you going?" Lucas demanded. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I think it wants us to go back." "That's insane," Mia said, shaking her head violently. "You're insane. I'm not going in there." But I wasn't listening anymore. The whispers were pulling me forward, their fragmented words just barely brushing the edges of comprehension. They weren't angry or malicious, they were pleading, calling. I reached the wall and placed my hand against it. The surface was cold, so cold it burned, but I didn't pull away. I pressed harder, and the whispers grew louder. The others were shouting at me, their voices frantic, but they sounded far away. The wall shuddered beneath my touch, and then slowly it began to give. A crack appeared, spreading outward like the first fracture in a sheet of ice. And then the door was back. The door stood in front of me again, impossibly real, as if it had never disappeared. The tarnished brass knob gleamed faintly in the dim light, and the wood radiated that same icy chill I felt through the wall. The whispers crescendoed, a chaotic, pleading chorus that seemed to echo in my skull. "Don't open it," Mia begged from behind me. Her voice cracked with fear, her sobs choking her words. "Please don't." But I couldn't stop myself. My hand moved toward the knob as if pulled by an unseen force. Every rational thought screamed at me to turn around, to get away, but something deeper compelled me forward. It wasn't just curiosity, it was inevitability. "Stop him," Lucas shouted, but no one moved. I think they all knew, deep down, that this was beyond us now. My fingers closed around the icy metal, and I turned the knob. The door swung inward soundlessly, revealing the room once more. It was the same as before, empty, dark, and impossibly cold, but now it felt alive. The walls seemed to pulse faintly, like they were breathing, and the floor beneath my feet felt unsteady, as if I was standing on something that could crumble at any moment. "I don't want to go in there," Mia whimpered, clutching Lucas's arm. Jake stood rigid, his jaw tight, but his eyes betrayed his fear. None of them moved, but I couldn't stop. I stepped inside. The air changed as soon as I crossed the threshold. The cold was sharper, cutting into my skin like shards of glass. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so profound it was deafening. I turned to look at the others, my heart pounding, but they were still in the hallway, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Are you coming?" I asked, my voice trembling. "No," Jake said flatly. "Not again." "Don't leave me alone in here," I said, my voice rising in desperation. "Please." Lucas took a hesitant step forward, but Mia grabbed his arm, shaking her head violently. "Don't," she whispered. "You saw what happened to Lucy. Don't." He hesitated, torn between fear and loyalty, but the decision was made for him. The door slammed shut between us, the sound reverberating through the room like a gunshot. I lunged for the handle, but it was gone, replaced by smooth, seamless wood. I was trapped. I pressed my ear to the door, banging my fists against it. "Open it," I screamed. "Get me out of here." But no one answered. The silence was suffocating, pressing against me like a physical weight. I turned back to the room, my eyes darting around, searching for something. A way out, a clue, anything. That's when I saw it. The far wall wasn't empty anymore. A single word was scrawled across it in what looked like ash or soot stay. My breath caught in my throat. The word seemed to pulse, the letters shifting slightly, as if they were alive. I took a step closer, and the floor creaked beneath me. The sound was impossibly loud in the silence, echoing back at me like laughter. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The word on the wall disappeared, the soot fading into nothingness. Then new words began to form, the letters appearing one by one as if an invisible hand were writing them. "It takes what it needs." "What does?" I asked, backing away from the wall. My voice was barely audible, swallowed by the cold. "What are you talking about?" The words shifted again, dissolving into ash before reforming. "Us." A shiver ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" I demanded, my voice rising in panic. "Who's us? Lucy. Is she?" The wall rippled, the words distorting as they faded away. The silence returned, heavier now, oppressive. I felt the floor shift beneath me, the wood groaning as if something massive was moving below. Then I heard it. A soft, wet sound, like something dragging itself across the floor. It was coming from the shadows in the corner of the room. My breath hitched as I turned to look, and my stomach dropped. Something was there. At first it was just a shape, a dark, amorphous mass that seemed to writhe and shift, as if it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. But then it began to take form, its edges solidifying into something grotesque. It had no face, no eyes, but I could feel it watching me. Its body was long and twisted, its limbs too many and too thin, bending at impossible angles as it crawled toward me. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. "Stay back," I whispered, though my voice was barely audible. The thing didn't stop. It moved with a jerking, unnatural rhythm, each motion accompanied by that wet, dragging sound. I hit the wall, my hands scrambling against the smooth surface as I searched for the door that wasn't there. The thing was closer now, its twisted limbs reaching out for me, and I could feel the cold radiating off it in waves. It stopped just inches from me, its faceless head tilting as if it was studying me. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then it spoke. Its voice wasn't a voice at all. It was 1,000 voices, layered and overlapping, some whispering, some screaming, all speaking at once. "It takes what it needs," it said, the words echoing in my head. "And so do we." Before I could scream, the room went dark. The darkness was absolute, swallowing everything, even the sound of my own breathing. I didn't know if my eyes were open or closed, it made no difference. The cold was unbearable now, seeping into my bones and making my limbs feel heavy and numb. I pressed my back harder against the wall, as if I could somehow sink into it and escape whatever was in that room with me. But I wasn't alone. I could hear it. The wet, dragging sound, moving closer, circling me. The thing's presence was suffocating, like standing in the shadow of something ancient and malevolent. My pulse thundered in my ears, but I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I could only wait. "Why me?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling and small in the oppressive void. "What do you want?" The voices came again, a cacophony of whispers and wails that made my head feel like it was splitting open. "It takes what it needs," they said again, like a mantra. "And you belong." "No," I whispered, shaking my head even though I knew it couldn't see me. "I don't belong here. Let me go." The thing didn't respond. Instead, I felt something cold and slick brush against my arm. I jerked away, a strangled cry escaping my throat, but there was nowhere to go. The darkness pressed in on me from all sides, and the thing was still there, its presence growing heavier with each passing second. And then the whispers started again, but this time they were different. Familiar. "Please don't leave me," a voice said, soft and broken. It was Lucy's voice. "Lucy," I gasped, my heart skipping a beat. "Is that you?" "She's with us now," the voices said, overlapping and distorted. and soon, you will be too. No, I screamed, my voice breaking. I thrashed against the darkness, my hands clawing at the wall behind me, but it was smooth and unyielding. I'm not staying here. Let me out. The thing moved closer, its faceless head looming just inches from mine. I could feel its cold breath against my skin, hear the faint, guttural sounds it made as it shifted and writhed. You opened the door, it said, the voices intertwining like a choir of the damned. You let us in. I didn't know, I pleaded, tears streaming down my face. I didn't know what would happen. Please, I just want to leave. The thing tilted its head, as if considering my words. Then, slowly, it began to retreat, its twisted limbs dragging across the floor. The darkness didn't lift, but the suffocating pressure lessened slightly, and I could finally breathe again. But the voices didn't stop. It takes what it needs, they said again, softer this time, almost mournful. And you are not enough. Before I could process what that meant, the ground beneath me shifted. The floor seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone, and I felt myself being pulled downward. I screamed, clawing at the wall, but it was no use. The floor gave way, and I was falling. The sensation was disorienting, like being plunged into freezing water. My limbs flailed, but there was nothing to grab onto, nothing to stop the endless descent. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more frantic, until they were all I could hear. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the fall stopped. I hit something solid, the impact jarring the breath from my lungs. I lay there for a moment, gasping, my body trembling with adrenaline. The whispers were gone, replaced by an eerie, unnatural silence. Slowly, I opened my eyes. I was back in the cabin, or at least I thought I was. The room looked the same grey walls, the same oppressive cold, but something was different. The air felt heavier, the shadows darker, and the faint metallic smell was stronger now, almost suffocating. Hello, I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the empty space. No one answered. I stumbled to my feet, my legs weak and unsteady. The door was gone again, the wall smooth and seamless. I turned in circles, my panic rising with each passing second. And then I saw them. The walls weren't smooth anymore. They were covered in faces, dozens of them, their features twisted in expressions of pain and terror. Their eyes were wide, unblinking, and their mouths were frozen in silent screams. Lucy, I whispered, my stomach turning to ice. Her face was there, near the center of the far wall. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I thought I saw them move, a flicker of recognition in their depths. I'm sorry, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. I'm so sorry. The walls began to move then, the faces writhing and shifting, their mouths opening and closing as if they were trying to speak. The whispers returned, louder than ever, overlapping and chaotic. You belong, they said, the words hammering into my skull. You belong. I backed away, my hands covering my ears, but the voices were inside me now, impossible to escape. The walls were closing in, the faces pressing closer, their silent screams growing louder and louder until the door burst open. Blinding light flooded the room, and I stumbled backward, shielding my eyes. When I looked up, I saw Jake, Lucas, and Mia standing in the doorway, their faces pale and haunted. Come on, Jake shouted, holding out his hand. We have to go. I didn't hesitate. I ran toward them, my heart pounding, and grabbed Jake's hand. The moment I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me, cutting off the whispers. We didn't stop running. We tore through the cabin, out the front door, and into the woods, the cold night air biting at our skin. None of us looked back. When we finally reached the cars, we didn't say a word. We just piled in and drove, the headlights cutting through the darkness as we sped away from that cursed place. But even now, as I sit here writing this, I can still feel it. The cold, the whispers, the faces in the walls. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I see Lucy. She's still in there, trapped, waiting. And I can't shake the feeling that one day, the door will find me again.